Hey everyone, I'm Trevor Spires, and you are watching an end-to-end installation guide of TKG and AKO version 1.3 on vSphere. This guide is meant to serve as a manual or guide for somebody who needs to get a TKG dev environment up and running, or possibly even a proof of concept or demo environment for themselves or for some stakeholder for their organization. So if you follow this guide from beginning to end, what you'll end up with is a very simple TKG deployment. So that'll be one management cluster, one workload cluster, along with that Avi Kubernetes operator that is responsible and capable of controlling ingress L7 and L4 load balancing into that TKG workload cluster. So I hope this is useful. It was a lot of fun for me to make. And if you have any questions or if there's anything I can help you with related to AKO or to TKG, please just reach out. Let's get started. All right, so this is part 2 in the series. This video is meant to be your TKG and Avi Sherpa. I'm going to be your Kubernetes and Avi shaman as I guide you through the installation of this system. My hope is you'll have it installed and have a nice test environment for yourself or for your organization to begin deploying or testing your Kubernetes clusters. Here's the versions of everything that I have in the lab that we're going to walk through today. I'm not going to walk through all the versions. You can pause the video if you need to know exactly what they all are, but you can use this as a guide. I would still recommend you reference the compatibility guides for TKG and AKO if you're moving forward with this, especially if your lab doesn't match this exactly, because depending on the version of vSphere, Avi, TKG, Kubernetes, there's a lot of different variables that will impact your deployments. I'm going to go ahead and navigate here on the VMware website to show you how you would get the bits necessary to install the command line tools, the OVAs, and everything else that is required for the service. So all I need to do is go find Tanzu Kubernetes Grid within my VMware portal. By the way, you're going to see this one called Integrated Edition. Unless you know that you need an Integrated Edition, let's go ahead and skip that. Today we're focused on the TKG platform, the core platform. All right. From here, you can download both TKG and the load balancer bits. The load balancer, all you need to download is the OVA for the Avi controller. But for TKG, there's quite a number of components, and you're not going to necessarily download all of these. It's just what you need for your environment. So Mac, Linux, Windows, you're going to download your specific Tanzu CLI implementation. Personally, I'm using the VMware images for my clusters, so I'm going to be using version 1.19 and 1.20 to build my clusters out, but you could use other versions of Kubernetes. And there are also Ubuntu images if you wanted to use that rather than the more kind of pared down VMware image. Finally, there's kubectl and some extensions. Again, I'm going to highly recommend that as you're preparing your bootstrap environment, you simply reference this document to make sure you get the components that are right for you. All right, so I've broken the installation process down to 7 high-level steps, and I'm going to walk you through those right now. Step 1 to installing TKG is that you need to prep your network, all right? There's not too intense of network requirements, but you do need a few different things, okay? You're going to need a network to run your Kubernetes nodes, and that network is going to need to be DHCP enabled, okay? That's because these Kubernetes nodes are spun up, and when they're spun up, they need to be able to pull an IP address to join the cluster and make their communications back. So you need to have DHCP enabled on that node network, okay? Past that, there are a lot of different topologies supported. I think some people will probably deploy their service engines on the same network as their nodes. I believe that's supported, but I've chosen to have a dedicated VIP network for my service engine. So what you're going to see is my VIPs are sitting on a different subnet than my nodes. I kind of like this model because I can just have a separate network for my VIPs and for my nodes. It makes more sense. I think it's probably more likely what you'd see in a sort of production deployment. Finally, I've got my management network. Again, you don't have to have a separate management network. This is just best practice. It's a really simple environment. You do need to have DNS and NTP up and running. You also need to have an Avi controller installed, and you need to have some bootstrap environment. I'm using a Linux Ubuntu VM, but you could use a Windows VM, a Mac. You could even use your laptop. It really doesn't matter. All right. I have one other connection noted here. The Avi SEs need some management connection back to their controller, so that way the controller can push that config down. Same with AKO. Whenever it listens for the Kubernetes objects, it needs to be able to push those API calls to the controller, so that way It can make the changes to spin up and spin down your services on your service engine. So these are important connections to the system operating. I just want to reiterate one final time. This is not the only supported topology. This is probably not even the best topology. This is just my topology. Okay. So please reference the documentation, see what makes most sense for you. If you have firewalls or ACLs in your environment, definitely take time to ensure that you have the correct ports and protocols open. If your environment's wide open like mine, it should be pretty simple. Things should just work as long as all your networks are routable to one another. Finally, if you know anything about Kubernetes already, you probably know that Kubernetes clusters, they have their node network, right? And that's the actual IP that you give the Kubernetes VM, so the worker nodes and the control nodes. But they also communicate and have different subnets for like their pods. We're going to specify that as at deploy time, okay? But those networks are kind of interesting because while they do exist within the cluster, they're largely being encapsulated by Geneve via Antria, but as nodes are communicating between one another. So while those are very important, you don't necessarily need to prep your physical network with those subnets because those are all going to be encapsulated and tunneled between the various environments if you're using Antria as the CNI. All right, so if your network is all set up, you're going to want to prepare what's called a bootstrap environment. This document walks you through the step-by-step installation for some sort of bootstrap environment. You're going to install Tanzu CLI and kubectl. Okay, you're looking at the document that you should follow to get this installed. This is the one piece of this that I'm not going to walk you through end to end because it does change depending on what you use as a bootstrap environment, whether that's a Mac, Linux, or Windows machine. But it's really kind of simple. This doc walks you through step by step. You simply just need to install the Tanzu CLI and you need to install kubectl on that machine as well. There's going to be one more aspect to that where you generate a key so that way we can build a trust relationship between the system to authenticate with your clusters. But other than that, this is a pretty simple environment. And I've already got this set up in my environment, but just to show you, I'm going to run the Tanzu version command, and you're going to see that version 1.3 of .tanzu CLI has been installed on this virtual machine. One important prerequisite is actually pulling a public key for use with your deployment of your management cluster. So I need to make sure that I go in and grab the public key. Now, I've already created my key pair for this VM, and that's what I'm going to be using, but you may need to create your own, especially if this is an environment where you need to share the key or document that key somewhere else. So I'm going to go ahead and take my public key, and remember there's a public and a private key. I need the public key specifically, and I'm going to paste that into this notepad so I can reference it later. All right, so step 3, we're going to prep our vCenter environment, okay? Again, there's a document walking you by step how to do that. Creating folders, resource pools, things like that are optional. I've created a folder in my environment, but not a resource pool. Things like port groups and a data store, those are not optional. You need to have a network to put your systems on, and you need to have somewhere to store the bits for those systems, okay? You're also going to download the OVAs for the Kubernetes nodes from VMware's website. You're going to need a service account with the permissions that are documented here, and you're also going to need to pull the SSL thumbprint from your vCenter. All right, let's look at that now. I'm now logged into my vSphere environment where I'm going to show you some of the steps that I've taken to prepare, okay? So the first thing that I did is I created this TKG folder, all right? What I've also done is I've downloaded the Photon Kubernetes image from the VMware website, and I've uploaded that as an OVA, okay? I'm not going to show you this process, but just so you know, to get these templates, all you need to do is download that OVA, right-click in vCenter to deploy that OVA, and then walk through the deployment process. You don't even need to power the OVA on. As soon as you see it in the VMware inventory, you can just go ahead and convert that to a template. It just needs to be a template that's there so TKG can use it to launch additional systems. I'm using my administrator at vSphere.local as a service account because that's the super user account. It has all permissions, but the permissions necessary are documented. So if you'd like to create or follow a least privilege model, which highly recommend, please reference the documentation and ensure you provision an account that has the proper permissions. All right, now I'm going to walk you through the Avi installation process. This is the last prerequisite before we start installing and managing our clusters, okay? Again, there's a great document that walks you through this process step by step that I would highly recommend you follow. Okay, so I'm in my environment. I have pre-deployed my Avi controller just to save a little bit of time. You need to deploy this OVA yourself. Again, you just download the OVA, you give it an IP and the relevant information to connect to your network, and you power it on. Okay. Now that I've got it spun up, I can just simply navigate to the IP address that I set, or the FQDN that I have in DNS set for this controller. And so here I am logged in. I'm going to go ahead and set my admin password. I'm going to put in my DNS information. I'm going to use the default NTP, but if you have NTP set up privately in your infrastructure, be sure to put that in there. This is just for some SNMP information. I'm going to skip through that. Okay, now I need to select my orchestrator. I'm going to go ahead and set up my VMware vSphere orchestrator, because that is what's going to be leveraged by this integration. All right, so in here, I'm going to put my username. I'm going to put my password. And I'm also going to put my vCenter's FQDN or IP address, so that way my Avi controller can connect and set up that cloud connector. I'm definitely deploying mine in write mode, and that is also what I would recommend for you to do. It's going to make your life a heck of a lot easier. One interesting thing you might see, I am not using an SDN integration. You do not need NSX to deploy a TKG cluster. You don't, okay? NSX can be used as a CNI for TKG, but generally speaking, if I were deploying this in my environment, I would not use NSX unless I'm already a heavy NSX user, very experienced with the product. Instead, what I would choose to do is use Avi as the ingress, like I'm doing here, and then simply use Ontria or some other east to west communications plugin in your environment other than NSX. Here, I'm going to select my management network, okay? I'm going to make mine static. I believe either option will be supported for your environment, okay? So I'm going to select my data center here. I'm going to select static routes, and I'm going to leave everything else at the default. Okay, now I just need to select my management network. This is going to be unique to your environment, but I have mine predetermined, so I'm going to go ahead and type in a range. All right, all my IP info is put in here. It looks good to me. I've got a range of 10 addresses, but if you're going to be deploying a lot of service engines, you may want a larger range than that for your management network. I'm not going to select multi-tenancy in my deployment. I do believe it's supported, but I don't need it because this is just a demo environment for me. Okay, my setup is now complete. Now I should be able to log in to my Avi controller and see that I've got my vCenter cloud created. So I'm going to go to infrastructure, clouds, and lo and behold, look at that, I've got my vCenter cloud. Now it's still making some calls to my vCenter. If I wait for just a moment, this should turn green very soon. All right, my vCenter cloud is all green. My next step is actually going to be to go to my networks and prep my networks, okay? Now, I should have already my management network prepped. Remember, during the setup process, I specified that this would be my management network. But I also want to make sure that I'm prepping particularly my front end network. This is the network where I've chosen to provision my VIPs for Avi. So I need to give it IP addresses so that Avi knows what IPs to assign on that front end. So all I need to do is come in and add a subnet that I'm going to deploy my VIPs on, okay? And this is basically going to be a pool of IPs that as I'm provisioning and deprovisioning my load balancers or my ingresses in Kubernetes, this is where the IPs are going to be pulled from, all right? So I've got my /23 here, and I'm going to create a pool as well. All right, so I've created my pool. My network appears to be prepped. I'm going to go ahead and save that network. And I look good. You can see I've got 41 IPs there in that pool ready to be consumed. Now my node network, and this is going to be the server side of the Avi service engines, right? This is going to be where we're load balancing the traffic to. I'm going to go ahead and edit this because while I don't need to specify a pool, I do need to let this know that DHCP is enabled on that network so that way the service engine can pull an IP on that network to set forward traffic. I believe you could specify a static pool here as well within the Avi solution, but since I've got DHCP running, I'm just going to go ahead and rely on that. Okay, so my networks are all prepped. Now what I need to do is specify a DNS and IPAM profile and tie that to my vSphere cloud. So I'm going to go to Templates, IPAM and DNS profiles, and I'm going to start by creating an IPAM profile. All right, so I specified my IPAM profile, and I'm going to use the integrated IPAM in Avi. I'm going to leave allocate to VRF unselected in mine, and all I need to do is select that default cloud. All right, I'm setting up my IPAM profile for my front end network here because that's the one that I'm going to be pulling my VIPs from primarily, okay? And I also need to create a DNS profile. I'm going to go ahead and pop into that DNS profile section and create that now. So I'm going to give it a name, DNS profile. I'm going to use the integrated DNS, but again, there are third-party DNSs supported in Avi. And finally, I'm just going to add my domain, all right? All right, so this is the domain that I've chosen. It's my corp.tanzu domain, but then I've got tkg.nsxlb as the kind of subdomain there, this configuration anyway. And finally, once you have these configured, what you need to do is go back to your cloud connector for vCenter and simply add those profiles to your cloud connector. So in the cloud connector, I have the choice of selecting my IPAM profile that I just created, and I can also create my DNS profile as well. Now, I am enabling DHCP here because the documents say to do it, and that should be it. The one step that I didn't walk you all through is the creation of a service engine group. I'm going to be using the default group in my environment where I'm not really going to make any changes to my group, okay? I've got a enterprise license installed on this system, but you may want to determine what sort of license that you have, whether it's a basic, essentials, or an enterprise license, and that will determine what you can actually do within the service engine group. For example, if you had basic or essentials, you would be limited to active standby high availability, but because I'm running an enterprise license, I could use active or M+M, which is absolutely what we would recommend. This should be all that I need. I'm going to go ahead and save. Another piece that I didn't highlight with you all is just that if you need to make significant changes or you need to upload licenses, you can do that here, okay? If you're going to deploy essentials or basic, you need to come in here and edit the licenses accordingly so that way your service engine group is using the correct license for your deployment model. I have one final step for my controller setup, and that is that I need to configure a certificate. To do that, I'm going to go to Templates, Security. What I need to do is create a certificate for my controller. So I'm going to click Controller Certificate, and I'm going to click Create. I'm going to put in the FQDN of my controller. I have that configured in my DNS provider. I'm going to also have the same common name listed for that as well. And I'm going to add that to the subject alternative name here too. So I've added the FQDN of my controller to the name section, the common name section, and to the subject alternative name section. And I'm going to save that certificate right now. I'm also going to export this certificate because I'm going to need to get the certificate content from right here. I'm going to copy that to my clipboard, and I'm going to paste that into an additional text file here because I'm going to have to reference this during my setup process. All right, now I just need to go do my final step of actually assigning that certificate as the main certificate. So I'm going to edit this. What I'm going to do is go ahead and delete some of the default certificates. So I'm going to kill this certificate, and all I'm going to do is add that new certificate that I created in the previous screen. This is going to make this the certificate that's used for the controller. You can see as I refresh now, I have to retrust that certificate because that's been added to the controller. I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, and now I should be all set for my controller. I've got all of the necessary prerequisites in place, and I should now be ready to continue my installation process. So now I have all the prerequisites necessary in place to begin installing my first Tanzu management cluster. I'm going to be using the UI method. There is also a CLI installer for if you're maybe doing a lot of these deployments or if you want to automate the deployment. I would highly recommend checking that out. If this is your first time deploying a TKG cluster, you may consider just using the UI method to become familiar with the inputs and the process that is required to set that up. All right, so I've got a PuTTY session open to that Tanzu VM where I've got my Tanzu CLI installed, okay? I've got this installed, so all I need to do now that I've got all my prerequisites in place is to run this Tanzu management cluster create command with the --UI. And what's going to happen is The installer is going to open up a web browser on my machine. By the way, I'm using Putty, so that's linked to Putty as the default browser. And I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to deploy this in a vSphere environment. And now this is it. I've gotten to the install process. The prerequisites take much longer than the install. Now all I have to do is start putting in all of those inputs that I gathered over the last few minutes, and we'll have this cluster up and running in no time at all. So first things first, I need my vCenter address. I'm going to take that from here. I'm going to paste it in. Again, remember, this is going to be running from this VM. So it's very important that you have DNS working on that VM, or your setup is not going to work if you're specifying things like FQDNs, okay? I keep highlighting that because that's a pretty common mistake during setup, or maybe it's not common, but it's a mistake that I made during setup. I'm going to do this here. Put your credentials in, click connect, make sure everything's good. We're going to pull that certificate thumbprint here to pop that up. Okay, and so now it's going to ask, do you want to configure vSphere with Tanzu, or do you want to just deploy a TKG management cluster? There are different methods and really kind of two different ways you can deploy TKG on vSphere. I'm going to be going with the TKGm solution, which means I need to deploy my management cluster on a vSphere environment using this selection, okay? I need to select my data center. That was pulled from my vCenter through this authentication. All right, now I just need to paste in my public key that I pulled from my Ubuntu VM earlier in the video that I pasted to a notepad, all right? I'm gonna go ahead and select next. And now I'm gonna choose whether this is development or production. So I've chosen development. I'm gonna go and give my management cluster a name. I'm also going to specify an IP for my control plane endpoint. So this is where the Kubernetes is going to be listening on a particular IP, and that's going to be the API endpoint that we use to authenticate with this particular cluster, all right? And I'm going to use 100.99 for this because this is outside of my DHCP scope. You'll notice this is actually on the same network that I'm going to use to put my nodes on. That network has a DHCP scope, so I'm just using an IP that's outside of that DHCP scope, all right? Again, I'm going to make these a small worker node type as well, just because this is a dev deployment, and I should be all set to move on. Now I need to put in the information for my NSX Advanced Load Balancer. So I'm going to pull the host name of my NSX Advanced Load Balancer, which I've got right here in my DNS. So I'll pop that into my controller host. My username and password that I created during setup. I'm going to verify that. It looks like I have fat fingered my password during the installation. I forgot the password, and now I'm going to have to reinstall my Avi controller. So I'm going to take a brief break, and we will reconvene at that interface, hopefully with the correct password for my Avi controller after I reconfigure all of those settings. Okay, everybody, I have redeployed my Avi controller, and as you can see, I have now I clicked the verify button. You missed that part. I wasn't recording, but now I am authenticated to my Avi controller because I had the right password. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make some selections. So I need to select my Avi cloud. Remember, I'm referencing here. I'll show you in the controller as I go through this. I'm referencing this cloud, okay? So this default cloud, this default cloud name is the same default cloud name you see right here that is being pulled from the Avi controller, all right? Now I'm going to do my service engine group. Again, I'm just using the default service engine group. VIP network name, okay? So my VIP network name is going to be this one. I'm using my K8's front end network. So I can copy that, or you could type it in manually, but it does need to match. Okay, and then the VIP network CIDR, paste mine in here. And finally, the certificate authority. So this is where earlier, whenever I added a custom certificate to Avi, this is where I'm going to paste that certificate that I created. Again, I'm using all self-signed certs, so if you're in a real environment, you might need to adjust this to conform to your requirements. I'm popping that in there. We should be all good. I'm not going to add any cluster labels to my deployment because I'm going to keep mine really simple. I should be good here. I'm going to click next. Awesome. Now I am in optional metadata. I'm not going to use any optional metadata. for mine. Okay, cool. So I'm specifying my resources. I'm referencing this VM folder. Again, this is the folder in my vCenter that has all of those photon images that I uploaded and converted to templates in the GUI. All right. I'm also going to select my data store here. It should be all set there. I'm going to just select my management cluster. I only have one cluster, but you could, if you wanted to specify a specific compute to put it on, this is how you would do that. All right, and for my Kubernetes network, specify it's just going to be my K8's workload network. This is going to be the network where my nodes are deployed to. And I'm going to say, let's leave proxy disabled. So as you can see, we do have a couple of different options for identity management, but I'm just going to keep it simple and do local admin. Okay, and finally, I need to select the image that I'm going to deploy. So this particular version of TKG wants to deploy a version 1.20 compliant version of Kubernetes. So that is what I'm referencing here. I'm referencing my 1.20 image that's in vSphere as a template. All right, click next. I'm not going to register mine with Tanzu Mission Control because I don't have access to Tanzu Mission Control, so I'm not going to do that. And okay, now all we got to do is hope that we got all those inputs right. As you can see, the wizard itself only takes a couple seconds to fill out. Most of the work is in getting all the prerequisites up in place, your networks, your AVI controller, your images, etc. Let's see if it works. Here we go. Moment of truth. Oh, I guess not. I got to review the configuration first. I'm going to assume I got it all right. I'm going to live dangerously today. And by the way, just so you know, like this UI is not required. You could do this purely via the CLI, and they even show you the equivalent CLI command that you would have to run in order to make this happen. All this really is a wizard to put in a bunch of inputs into a YAML file, so that way we can build our management cluster based on those inputs. So again, if this is your first environment, I think you should use the UI if you're not familiar with how to provision this sort of stuff already. But if you've done it once before, highly recommend using this method. In fact, a coworker of mine, he has a great blog, Virtually Ghetto. I would go to that blog, and he has the step-by-step process for how you could automate this deployment using the command line. All right. So here we go. Moment of truth. I'm going to deploy my management cluster. Now, all we have to do is wait, okay? What's going to happen is the wizard's going to go through its process. It's going to prep the bootstrap environment. It's going to do all of its authentication. And ultimately, what we should see happening, assuming that I didn't mess anything up, is in a few moments, as this continues, we're going to eventually see that this bootstrap environment will be deploying those VMs that I specified, those two Kubernetes nodes that are going to be my management cluster. So right now, I'm just going to wait around for a while. I'll be back to show you exactly what this wizard spits out here in probably, last time I did this, it took actually about an hour. I'm in a highly nested, very low resource environment though, so it'll probably be faster if you're doing this on real hardware. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. All right, I got great news. It worked. So it looks like it took me, I don't know the exact amount of time, probably 30 or 45 minutes. It went through the process. I now have my management cluster up and running. So I can show you in vCenter actually. You can see I've got my two VMs. So now what I can do is start provisioning new clusters. I'm going to do that part tomorrow because this has been a long day. You'll see me wearing a different shirt in just a second, and then I'm going to show you how you can stand up your very first workload cluster. All right, bye. Okay, everybody, I'm back and in a much better mood. Hey, one thing I wanted to kind of call out, I didn't dig into this before, but I'd like to show it to you because I'm going to explain it in the CLI here in just a moment. I've talked about AKO. So AKO is the AVI Kubernetes operator, right? That is the system that coordinates whenever you provision ingress or load balancing objects in Kubernetes to configure that in the controller, okay? There is an AVI Kubernetes operator, and that goes in the workload cluster in this type of a deployment. But in the management cluster, what we have is not called an AVI Kubernetes operator. It's called an AVI Kubernetes operator, or AKOO, right? The reason for that is because when you deploy workload clusters, that AKOO is really what's responsible for deploying AKO. So in my environment, it'll deploy this one implementation of AKO, but you can use the AKO operator to just continue redeploying additional AKO pods into your clusters. All right, so I'm in my bootstrap system. This is where I installed the first management cluster from. So from here, I'm going to run a few commands to explore the management cluster, show you kind of how it is initially provisioned, and then we will go into provisioning our very first workload cluster so we can actually deploy an app behind Avi. All right, so I'm in my workload cluster. And by the way, I've already done this, but if you've timed out or if you need to log in from a different system, you would just need to type this Tanzu login command and select your cluster that you want to log into, okay? To get my management cluster information, I'm just going to run this command, Tanzu management cluster get. And you'll see it's going to spit back from some details about my management cluster, okay? Now, I have my management cluster via the Tanzu CLI, but in order to actually interact with that cluster via kubectl, which is how generally admins would interact with the cluster itself, I need to log into that cluster. In order to log into that cluster, what I need to do is run this command, Tanzu management cluster kubectl get. So I'm going to get the kubectl for that cluster. I'm running this dash admin because I'm running everything as admin. I don't have any authentication, but if you have authentication, you may not necessarily need that flag. So I'm going to run that, and it's going to spit back, hey, you have the credentials for that cluster, and it's going to tell me if you'd like to access that cluster, simply run the following command. So I'm going to run that command. And I'm now inside of my management cluster. You can see if I run a get pods, you'll see all the various pods in my management cluster. All right. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time inside of my management cluster. The focus of this is going to be the workload cluster, but this is a Kubernetes cluster, so I could start provisioning pods here if I wanted to. I could provision my own namespaces. Whatever I need to provision within Kubernetes, I could start deploying in this management cluster. The one thing that I want to show you in this management cluster is this. So I've run a get pods on my namespace, TKG system networking. That's where we put the AKO operator, so AKO in the management cluster. And I just ran that to show you right here. This is my AKO operator. So remember, this is not AKO, this is AKO. So this is the operator that's responsible for deploying the other AKO environment. This one right here. This is what I'm talking about. This is AKO. This is AKO. Not the same thing. Okay, so you've gotten your management cluster provisioned and you can access it. Now, the very next step would be to deploy a workload cluster, okay? Now, in order to deploy a workload cluster, we're actually going to follow a process very, very similar to that of deploying a management cluster, but instead of using the user interface, I'm going to use the YAML file this time. So you know, when you provision your management cluster, all of the inputs that you put into that user interface are actually being saved to a YAML file. So if I go ahead and run an ls on this directory, this is the directory that the YAML that was generated for your management cluster has been spit out to. So I see this file, it has kind of like a random object ID. So what I can do is I'm just going to cat this file so you can see what's inside of it. And eventually we're actually going to edit this file to turn it into a brand new cluster. All right, so I'm inside the file, and you can see this is really just a YAML file that has a bunch of variables specified, all right? This is where you, if you wanted to make changes to your configuration, as an example, if you had a different VIP network that you wanted to leverage for a certain cluster, maybe you have a prod VIP network and a dev VIP network or something like that, you could come in here to edit the network settings and the subnet mask prior to deploying your workload cluster, all right? I'm going to keep basically all of my config exactly the same. There's only a couple of things that I'm going to have to change in order to use this file to deploy my first workload cluster. So what I'm going to do is just make a copy of the original file, and I'm going to save it to another file, and I'm just going to name this file my first cluster.yaml. All right. So now I should have that YAML file. So all I need to do now is go inside of that YAML file and edit a couple of variables so that way I can deploy this file as a workload cluster. So I'm just going to get inside of the file. So I'm going to navigate to that file that I just created, that my first cluster.yaml. And since I'm keeping most of my settings the same as my management cluster, there's only a couple of small things that I need to change. For me, what I'm going to have to change is the name, because I can't have two clusters with the same name in TKG. So for example, this TKG-MGT, I'm going to have to change to that my first cluster. I'd like it to be listed as that. And there is one other variable that I need to change. I need to change this control plane endpoint. So when you create a cluster, you're also specifying an IP endpoint so that you can authenticate with that specific cluster. That's how a cluster listens on the API. So I can't have two different clusters with the same API IP, so I need to edit this. So all I'm going to do is use the .98 IP because that's a free IP in my environment. And I'm leaving all of my other settings the same. Okay, so I've edited my YAML file. Now all that's left is to reference that file when deploying a workload cluster. And we should have a workload cluster deployed with Avi AKO installed. Let's give it a try. All right, so I'm going to paste my command in here. And this is the Tanzu command for creating a cluster. It's just Tanzu cluster create, and then I need to specify the file. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in the file path for that, my first cluster.yaml file that I created a moment ago. All right, that looks good. I also have an additional flag because I would like to deploy version 19 of Kubernetes, or 1.19, the version of Kubernetes. The reason I'd like to deploy that in my environment is strictly because the ingress and load balancing objects in Kubernetes have continued to change over time. This is the latest version of Kubernetes that works with AKO. I've got my command in place. Okay, so now I just got to press enter. It's going to validate my configuration, and if I got everything correct, it's going to begin configuring that cluster in my vSphere environment, okay? Hey, just as a reminder while this is provisioning, you see here how I specified the revision as being this version 1.19.18. Well, I pulled this from the documentation. This is the syntax that we need to reference that image, but just so you know, in order for this to work, you would need to have a template in your vCenter that is that version of Kubernetes. So I have that, or a node with running that version. So I've got that right here. So we just need to wait and see if there are no issues. We should start to see my nodes be deployed here in just a moment. And would you look at that? Right on time, my first, the control node, so the control Kubernetes node for that workload cluster that I just created is being deployed. You can see it has that name, my-first-cl. So I'm just going to hang tight for a few minutes. It doesn't take very long to deploy workload clusters compared to your first management cluster. Workload clusters I've seen usually are deployed in less than 5 minutes in my environment because it doesn't have to go through the same startup process. So I'm going to pause the video here. I'll be back in just a second, and then we'll be ready to deploy our very first application in the cluster. All right, my cluster is up. Check it out. Workload cluster successfully created. I can show you this in my vCenter. I've got my two nodes. I've just got one control plane node and then one worker node in my environment. And this is great news. So now the cluster is there. Now I need to go through that same process of getting my kubeconf for that cluster so that way I can log in. So I'm just going to run in the command to get that right now. You can see it spit that back. It says that I've saved the conf. So now I just need to run this command and I will be authenticated with the context of my worker cluster. Bada bing, bada boom. Let's see what we got. All right, it looks like I'm in my cluster. I can see all my default pods, and in those default pods, we've got a special guest. Check them out. This is my AKO pod. So this is that pod that's going to be configuring my Avi controller when I start specifying ingress and load balancer objects in my manifest files in Kubernetes. All right, so I've got my cluster up. It's sitting there waiting. So my very next step is just to go ahead and create an application. So I've got my manifest file. I'm going to go ahead and save it into my cluster, and then we're going to create our very first application. Hey, just as a side note, everyone, I did create a secret to authenticate with a public Docker registry so that way I could pull my pods whenever I run my manifest file here in a second. If you have Harbor or some other registry, you can authenticate with that. But in my environment, I didn't have that set up. I was hitting my max for pulling images from the public registry, so I had to authenticate with it so I could increase that maximum. Okay, so I have my manifest file. Okay, here's my spec. This has, again, this is the one that I went through in the demo video. There's no changes to this. So this is simply listening on 2 different services. Underneath that service, I've got an ingress that's referencing Avi with a /old URL and then a default URL. And then finally, I've got 2 different pods that are going to be running in the background. One is running the most recent version of Nginx, while the other is running an older version. Just a second ago where I showed you how I authenticated with a public registry so I could pull these images, you can see here where I've put that secret, that reg cred that I created right here into my spec, okay? Again, if you have a private registry already set up as the default, you don't need to do this, but I did not, so that's why I had to go through that step. So now all I'm going to do is copy and paste this into a file inside of my system. I'll go ahead and check the file just to make 100% sure that everything is all set. Looks like I got my 2 services. Yeah, everything looks good. So now is the moment of truth. I'm going to provision this application that I just pasted in with the spec file, that YAML file, the AKO split ingress, and we'll see if the deployment works. There's only one more thing that I want to show you, all right? I have also needed to edit my hosts file in Windows, okay? If you're not familiar with this, in Windows, you can keep a basically text file to add static DNS entries. The reason that I'm doing this is because I did not set Avi to be authoritative for the domain, okay? And in order to access the web page, I am going to need some kind of DNS record to make that work. So I've just added it manually here. But what I've seen other people do, which is very cool, is in Avi, you can just deploy a DNS service, and then in your DNS, you can make that Avi DNS service authoritative for whatever the subdomain you're using is. So for example, for me, maybe my subdomain is this default TKG.NSXLB. And so I could, from my corp.local domain, point it to my Avi service engine to resolve any requests from this subdomain. And that should be it. Now is the moment of truth. I'm going to go ahead and use that spec file to deploy my application. So I'm going to use that faithful command, kubectl, apply f, AKO, split ingress, ask. And I'm going to press enter and we'll see what happens. So press enter. And it looks like my containers are slowly spinning up here. I'll give them just another moment. All right, so my containers are running. Now it's time to test out my app. So first and foremost, I'll go ahead and open up my Avi deployment here. And we should see that because I specified those 2 different back ends, I now have my 2 pool members. One is for that traditional kind of default, and one is for that /old URL, okay? I can pop in here and see, here is the IP that I was given, and we can map that IP back to the host file, right? So you can see that's where I created the DNS record for that IP, okay? And the DNS record does match the app domain name, so I should, fingers crossed, be able to access this application now. So I'm gonna go over to my Windows here, click refresh, and look at that. My app is up and running. My packets are flowing right through my Avi load balancer. So I'll click refresh a couple times. I've got my Nginx config running on my main URL. And if I go to my /old, I should get some errors that show that I'm actually running this older version of Nginx on that /old URL. Okay, I kind of walked you through what this does in Avi last time. One thing I didn't show you last time, which I personally think is pretty compelling, is with this, if you begin using the service, you're going to get all of the logs and analytics that you would expect from your Avi system, okay? I don't have a lot of traffic hitting this VIP right now, so I don't have a tremendous amount of data coming into the service, but if you spin this up in your environment, you're going to be keeping all of the transaction logs, right? So I can even see, in my environment, I know why this isn't working, but if this is a real environment, you could use these analytics to see every single transaction and every single 404 response that we're getting to troubleshoot this application a little bit further. Pretty powerful stuff. really helps highlight probably the reason why you might choose to leverage Avi. Analytics are right at the top of the list. Okay, that's it. For my final trick, I'm just going to go ahead and delete that deployment that I made. Kubectl delete on the file, and my pod should be spun down. If I go back to my Avi controller, you'll see my pools should be gone. Yep, my pools are gone, and nothing's working. All right, so you can see it's been spun down. I no longer have my backend pools tied to the service. This was all deleted automatically by AKO. I'm going to show you one more thing just because I found this a very useful tool for learning how the system works. I'm going to pop into the Operations tab, and then from there, I'm going to go to Events, and I'm going to go to look at my events, and I'm actually going to even dig deeper and go to the config audit trail. Okay, so the reason I'm coming in here is because if you wanted to see the exact changes, right, that are being made by the AKO user, so you can see the user account is logging in to my Avi controller and making changes. I find this to be very, very useful because you can go in and see the exact API calls and the exact changes that are happening behind the scenes whenever you spin up your application in Kubernetes. So all of these config changes that can be seen in this audit trail are actually the AKO system in my cluster making these calls to my Avi controller, deploying, spinning VIPs up and spinning VIPs down. So pretty cool stuff. I think this is a useful learning tool if you want to really dive deep and understand what's happening behind the scenes. All right, everybody, that's all I got for you on this one. This has been a real pleasure to work on. I learned a lot during this process. And if you have any questions about AKO, about TKG, please feel welcome to reach out to me directly. And until next time, happy AKO, happy load balancing, happy cloud native applications, and happy April 16th. All right. Bye.